Dozens of admirals said no. Not because they were cowards, because every one of them understood what waited at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a graveyard of battleships, a demoralized fleet, a furious nation demanding someone to blame. Whoever took command would inherit a war already half lost, with no margin for a second mistake. Historians would later give it a name, the poisoned chalice, and one by one, the most decorated men in the United States Navy quietly made sure it never landed on their desk. So President Roosevelt turned to a man almost nobody had heard of, a rear admiral who ran a personnel office in Washington, a submariner who had once run a destroyer aground and been court-martialed for it. Not a warrior, a bureaucrat. The Navy brass thought Roosevelt had lost his mind. On Christmas morning, 1941, that man stepped off a flying boat at Pearl Harbor still wearing a civilian suit and looked out over a harbor choked with wreckage and burning oil. What he saw in the ruins, what almost no one else could see, would rebuild the Pacific Fleet from nothing and change the course of the war within 6 months. His name was Chester Nimitz. This is why every other admiral refused and why he did not. The morning of December 7th, 1941, begins the way every Sunday morning begins at Pearl Harbor. Church bells are being tuned for the 9 o'clock service. Sailors sleep off Saturday night in swaying hammocks below decks, the smell of coffee starting to drift up from the galleys. Officers' wives are laying out breakfast in quiet base housing, while their husbands sleep in, radios tuned low to a Honolulu station playing Sunday morning hymns. Battleship Row stretches along Ford Island like a monument to American power. 8 of the mightiest warships ever built, anchored in a neat, gleaming line, their gray hulls catching the first full light of a tropical morning. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. For 40 years, American naval doctrine has held one truth to be self-evident. No enemy fleet could ever reach these waters undetected. Pearl Harbor is the fortress. It is the reason 8 battleships and thousands of men can sleep without fear on a Sunday morning 3,000 miles from the nearest hostile coastline. It is the reason a 17-year-old seaman on Arizona's deck that morning is thinking about breakfast, not battle. At 7:55, that certainty ends forever. 353 Japanese aircraft descend out of the morning haze in 2 coordinated waves, torpedo bombers skimming so low over the water that sailors on deck can see the pilots' faces beneath their goggles. For one long, disbelieving moment, men on the decks below simply stand and watch, unable to process what their eyes are telling them. Then the first torpedoes slam into Battleship Row within minutes. Oklahoma takes 9 of them in rapid succession, her hull tearing open below the waterline, and within 8 minutes she rolls completely over, trapping hundreds of men inside an overturned steel tomb they will spend hours pounding on from the inside, praying someone above the waterline can hear them. Then Arizona. A single armor-piercing bomb punches through her deck and detonates in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion that follows is close to 1 million pounds of gunpowder igniting at once, a fireball that lifts the ship's bow entirely out of the water and rains fire and steel across the harbor for hundreds of yards. Men on nearby ships feel the shockwave in their chests before they hear the sound. 1,177 men die in that single blast, more American sailors than would die in some entire naval campaigns of the war still to come. Many of them are never found. Arizona will not be raised. She will not be repaired. She becomes, in the span of 9 seconds, a mass grave that still holds her crew today, oil still seeping from her wreck decades later, as if the ship itself has never stopped bleeding. By the time the second wave finishes its work, in under 2 hours, the most powerful naval base in the Pacific Ocean has ceased to exist as a fighting force. 5 battleships rest on the harbor floor. 3 more are crippled beyond immediate use. 188 American aircraft lie in twisted, burning wreckage on the ground, destroyed before most of them ever had a chance to leave the tarmac. 2,403 Americans are dead. It is, up to that morning, the worst single day in the history of the United States Navy, and the harbor itself will not stop burning until well after nightfall. The men who survive spend that afternoon and the days after, pulling bodies from oil-slicked water, listening to muffled hammering from inside Oklahoma's overturned hull that grows fainter each day until finally, on the fourth day, it stops. Rescue crews will cut through her bottom and free 32 men alive. Hundreds of others will not make it, and for weeks afterward, divers will still be pulling the dead from compartments that never flooded. Men who suffocated slowly in air pockets while rescue crews worked as fast as human hands could cut through steel. In Washington, the response is immediate, and it is not gentle. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, a career officer who had spent 37 years building toward exactly this command, is stripped of it on December 17th. He is reverted to his permanent two-star rank of Rear Admiral. Those who know him describe a man who has aged a decade in 10 days, who walks the wreckage of his own fleet each morning before the investigators arrive, searching for an answer to a question that will follow him for the rest of his life. The investigations begin almost before the wreckage stops smoking, the first of what will eventually become 9 separate inquiries spanning the rest of his life. Kimmel will spend the next quarter-century trying to clear his name. He will never fully succeed. History will argue about his guilt for generations, but on the afternoon he is relieved, none of that matters yet. What matters is a simpler, more brutal fact. The United States Navy has lost its Pacific Fleet, and it currently has no one in command of what remains. Vice Admiral William Pye takes over as acting commander, a caretaker holding a position no one wants to hold permanently, aware that every decision he makes in these weeks will be measured against a disaster that has already happened once. His first major decision will define the mood of those first desperate weeks. A relief force has been steaming toward Wake Island, a tiny American garrison under Japanese siege in the Central Pacific, close enough that reinforcement might still be possible. Pye considers the risk of exposing what remains of the fleet, weighs it against the cost of losing the island, and orders the relief force to turn back. It is a defensible decision on paper, made by a cautious man in an impossible position. It feels, to the men making it, and the men who will judge it later, like surrender. Wake Island falls to Japanese forces on December 23rd. The garrison, outnumbered and out of ammunition, fights until it physically cannot fight anymore, and news of its fall lands in Washington like one more stone added to a weight that is already crushing. It is not an encouraging start. In the officers' clubs and mess halls across Oahu, men who 2 weeks earlier had trusted their own leadership without question now find themselves second-guessing every order that comes down from the acting commander's office, and Pye himself, aware of the whispers, grows more cautious rather than less, which only deepens the sense among the ranks that Pearl Harbor has not yet stopped losing. And it exposes the deeper problem that Washington is only beginning to grasp. This is not simply a question of who will replace Kimmel. It is a question of who will agree to. Word moves quickly through the officer corps, the way word always does in a service built on reputation and seniority. Whoever accepts command of the Pacific Fleet now inherits a shattered force, a devastated public, and the near certainty that the Japanese will strike again somewhere before any of it can be rebuilt. There will be no honeymoon period, no time to get his footing. The political exposure is total. The margin for error is exactly zero. Historians will later give this unwanted assignment a name that captures it precisely. The poisoned chalice, offered to men who understand exactly what drinking from it might cost them. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox flies to Hawaii himself to see the damage firsthand, walking the length of Battleship Row while oil still burns on the water's surface days after the attack, the smell of scorched metal and fuel thick enough to cling to his uniform for days after he leaves. What he witnesses there hardens something in him. His report back to President Roosevelt is not diplomatic. New leadership is needed immediately, he tells the president, and it needs to come from outside the chain of command that presided over this disaster. The question that follows consumes Washington through the second week of December. Who? It is not an easy question, and it is not one that can be answered by simply reaching for the next name on a seniority list. The obvious candidates, men with decades of surface warfare experience, men who have commanded battleship divisions and carrier groups, are examined one at a time and quietly set aside. Some are judged too cautious for a moment, that demands aggression. Others are too closely tied, by friendship or by chain of command, to the officers already under investigation. A few are simply the wrong temperament for a command that will require rebuilding an institution from its foundations while an enemy fleet prowls unopposed across half an ocean. Behind closed doors, more than one flag officer quietly makes clear, through friends, through intermediaries, through carefully worded silence, that he would rather not be considered at all. Frank Knox works through the list at his desk in Washington, with the same grim determination he brought to Pearl Harbor's wreckage, and the name that keeps rising to the top surprises almost everyone who hears it. It does not belong to a carrier admiral or a battleship commander. It belongs to a quiet, gray-haired rear admiral, currently running a personnel office, a man most of the American public has never heard of, and most of the Navy's fighting admirals regard, if they think of him at all, as an administrator rather than a warrior. No one yet knows how much that assessment is about to be proven wrong. But in the third week of December, with the wreckage of Battleship Row still smoldering and the Pacific Fleet's future hanging on a decision no one wants to make, that name is placed on President Roosevelt's desk. And Roosevelt, who has been quietly watching this particular officer for 2 years, does not hesitate. 3,000 miles away in Hawaii, the men of the shattered Pacific Fleet have no idea any of this is happening. They know only that Christmas is approaching, that their harbor still smells of oil and ash, and that somewhere in Washington a decision is being made about who will lead them back into a war that has already cost them more than anyone imagined possible in a single Sunday morning. For now they wait, the way soldiers and sailors have always waited, in the dark, for orders from men they have never met. On December 16, 1941, 9 days after the attack, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz is at his desk in the Bureau of Navigation in Washington, buried in the unglamorous work of deciding which officers should be assigned where, across a Navy that is suddenly scrambling to fight a two-ocean war. He is 56 years old, a quiet, silver-haired Texan from the small German settlement of Fredericksburg, a man whose career has been built almost entirely away from headlines. He has commanded submarines. He has commanded destroyers. He helped pioneer techniques for refueling ships at sea that will prove critical in the years ahead, and he personally oversaw the Navy's difficult conversion of its submarine fleet from gasoline engines to safer, more reliable diesel propulsion. He is, by any fair account, one of the most capable engineers and administrators in the entire Navy. He is also, by the conventional standards of December 1941, exactly the wrong man to lead a fleet into war. He has never commanded a carrier task force. He has never led men into a modern naval battle. His most dramatic moment in nearly 4 decades of service came in 1908, as a young officer, when he ran the destroyer Decatur aground in the Philippines and was court-martialed for it, a humiliation he has carried quietly ever since. A message arrives summoning him to the office of Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. Nimitz walks the short distance between buildings without any particular sense of what is coming. Men are summoned to Knox's office for 100 different reasons most days, and there is no reason for him to suspect that this one will be different. Knox does not ease into it. The Pacific Fleet needs a new commander, he tells Nimitz. President Roosevelt has chosen him. The appointment is effective immediately. By every account from men who were there or who spoke with Nimitz afterward, his reaction is not enthusiasm. It is something closer to quiet, controlled alarm. Dozens of admirals senior to him remain on active duty, men with more command experience, more combat seasoning, more claim by tradition and seniority to exactly this post. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, has doubts about the choice, doubts he does not fully hide. And a new appointment is coming that will make Nimitz's position even more precarious. Admiral Ernest King, a famously hard, unsentimental officer about to be named Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, considers Nimitz a desk admiral, a peacetime bureaucrat who has spent the war so far shuffling paperwork while other men have already tasted combat. King's skepticism will not soften quickly. It will take the better part of a year and considerable results before he fully trusts the man Roosevelt has chosen. But Roosevelt is not building his decision on a seniority list, and he is not interested in what looks correct on paper. He has been quietly watching Chester Nimitz for 2 years, ever since Nimitz, then running the Bureau of Navigation, proved himself in meeting after meeting to be sharp, unflappable, and precise under pressure that would have unsettled far more celebrated men. There is a story that circulates quietly among those who know both men well. In early 1941, months before the attack, Roosevelt had actually offered Nimitz command of the Pacific Fleet outright. Nimitz turned it down. He told the president he did not want to leap over the heads of dozens of officers senior to him, that doing so would damage morale and violate a tradition he believed in. It was, at the time, viewed as an act of humility and institutional loyalty. By December of 1941, with the fleet in ruins and desperate for a man untouched by the disaster, that same decision looks less like modesty and more like fate quietly arranging itself. What Roosevelt sees in Nimitz is not charisma, it is a pattern. He sees a man who has personally commanded vessels ranging from small submarines to full-sized battleships, who understands supply chains and fuel logistics and personnel management as thoroughly as he understands naval tactics, who has spent an entire career solving unglamorous problems that other officers considered beneath their ambition. Above all, Roosevelt sees a builder, and in December 1941, with the Pacific Fleet's battleship force sitting broken on the harbor floor, what the Navy desperately needs is not another fighter eager for glory. It needs someone capable of taking a broken institution, a demoralized officer corps, a panicked public, and a scattered, half-functioning collection of ships, and slowly, patiently turning it back into a force capable of winning a war. The American press, when the appointment becomes public, is not impressed. The public wants a fighter, a swaggering, aggressive commander who radiates vengeance for Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt has given them a soft-spoken Texan who once ran a diesel engine school, whose only brush with public infamy was a court-martial 3 decades earlier for grounding a destroyer as a young officer. Navy brass in Washington voice their doubts in private conversations that do not stay entirely private. Nimitz is aware of all of it. When he raises his concerns to Roosevelt directly, worried aloud about jumping over so many senior officers and about the scale of what is being asked of him, the president's answer is simple, almost dismissive of the entire debate. "Get out there," Roosevelt tells him, "and don't come back until the war is won." Admiral Nimitz leaves Washington by train on December 19th, traveling west across a country that has been at war for less than 2 weeks and is still adjusting to the shock of it. The journey takes 6 days, crossing a continent gripped by blackout drills and sudden anxiety about enemy attack on the mainland itself. He reaches the West Coast and boards a PB-2Y Coronado flying boat for the final leg of the journey to Hawaii, watching from a small window as the endless gray Pacific unrolls beneath him, an ocean that in a matter of months will become the largest battlefield in human history. He arrives at Pearl Harbor at 7 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day, 1941, still wearing a civilian suit because there had been no time and little reason to arrange a formal uniform for a journey made this suddenly. What greets him is devastation on a scale that no report from Washington had fully prepared him for. The harbor is choked with wreckage. A thin, oily sheen still coats large stretches of the water 18 days after the attack. The superstructures of sunken battleships jut up out of the surface at broken, unnatural angles, gray steel against a bright tropical sky that seems almost obscene in its cheerfulness. The smell hits him before anything else, a thick, clinging mixture of burnt fuel and scorched metal that will not fully leave the harbor's air for weeks. Men working the salvage operations move through the wreckage with the flattened, hollow expressions of people who have been doing something exhausting and grim for far too long, pulling debris and, occasionally still, human remains from compartments the water has not yet given up. It would be easy, standing at the edge of that harbor on Christmas morning, in a rumpled civilian suit, to see only ruin. But Nimitz, walking the wreckage that first day, begins noticing something else, something that will shape everything he does in the months ahead. The Japanese struck the battleships, the largest, most visible, most symbolically important targets in the harbor. They did not strike the fuel tank farms that hold the fleet's entire oil reserve, a target that, if destroyed, would have crippled American naval operations in the Pacific for a year or more. They did not destroy the repair yards and dry docks, the very machinery that will be needed to rebuild whatever can be rebuilt. They did not touch the submarine base, tucked along the harbor's edge, quiet and intact. And every single aircraft carrier assigned to the Pacific Fleet had been out at sea on December 7th, delivering aircraft to island garrisons, untouched by the attack entirely. The battleship navy that America has built its entire pre-war doctrine around is gone. But the tools to build something different, something the Japanese planners never fully accounted for, are still standing. 6 days later, on December 31st, 1941, Chester Nimitz formally assumes command of the United States Pacific Fleet. Tradition calls for such a ceremony to take place on the deck of a battleship, the flagship of American naval power. There are no battleships available to host it. Instead, Nimitz reads his orders of command from the deck of the submarine Grayling, a small, unglamorous vessel that becomes, almost by accident, a perfect symbol for what is happening. A submariner, an engineer, a man the Navy establishment dismissed as a paperwork officer, is inheriting a surface fleet that in any traditional sense no longer exists. His first real act as commander tells the men around him everything they need to know about what kind of leader has just arrived. The staff officers who served under Kimmel, men like Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton and War Plans Officer Charles McMorris, expect to be quietly transferred out in disgrace. Their former commander has been publicly humiliated and stripped of rank. By the unwritten rules of military culture, they assume their own careers are effectively finished, tainted by association with a disaster none of them could have prevented alone. Nimitz calls them together, not for a lecture, not for a purge, but for a conversation. He tells them plainly that any officer who wants a transfer will have his full support in arranging one. But he says he hopes most of them will choose to stay. These are the men, he explains, who understand the Pacific theater, who know the enemy's patterns, who hold the accumulated knowledge that no replacement officer could rebuild quickly enough to matter. Firing them wholesale would satisfy a public hungry for someone, anyone, to be punished. Keeping them, trusting them, might actually help win the war. Nearly all of them choose to stay. The rebuilding that follows does not begin with ships, because there are almost none to spare. It begins, deliberately and methodically, with people. Nimitz understands something that neither the newspapers back home nor most of the politicians in Washington seem to grasp. The Pacific Fleet has not been destroyed. It has been badly damaged. Its aircraft carriers remain intact. Its submarine force remains intact. Its intelligence apparatus, the small, strange group of men working to break Japanese naval codes, remains intact. What is genuinely broken, what actually threatens the fleet's ability to fight, is morale, the fragile confidence of thousands of sailors and officers who watched their fortress fall in under 2 hours and have spent every day since wondering if it could happen again at any moment. His approach in those first weeks is patient and almost unglamorous. He visits nearly every command in the harbor personally. He talks with sailors pulling wreckage from the water, with junior officers still shaken by what they witnessed, with senior staff nursing wounded pride and private guilt. He does not deliver rousing speeches promising swift vengeance. He does not make grand public declarations. He asks questions. He listens, often for long stretches, before saying very much at all. Then, based on what he has heard, he acts. The effect on morale is almost immediate and deeply felt. Men who fully expected to be scapegoated for a disaster far above their pay grade discover instead a commander who appears to genuinely trust them, who treats them as professionals rather than as symbols of a national humiliation. Slowly, unevenly, the Pacific Fleet begins to function again, not as the battleship-centered force it had been on December 6th, but as something new, something built instead around aircraft carriers, submarines, and an intelligence operation that almost nobody outside a small basement room even knows exists. That intelligence operation proves its worth faster than anyone in Washington expects. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort leads a small, unconventional unit known as Station Hypo, working to break into the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated JN-25. Rochefort himself is something of a legend even before Midway, an eccentric, brilliant officer who works for days at a stretch in a windowless basement room, often in a bathrobe instead of a uniform, sleeping in short bursts on a cot when exhaustion finally overtakes him. He is, by the account of nearly everyone who worked alongside him, one of the finest cryptanalysts to ever serve in American military history, a man capable of holding enormous, fragmentary puzzles of intercepted signal traffic in his head for weeks, while patterns slowly emerge. Nimitz does something that a more conventional, more cautious commander might not have dared to do. He places enormous trust in Rochefort's analysis, even when it conflicts directly with assessments coming out of Washington. In the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team begins picking up fragments suggesting the Japanese are planning a massive offensive aimed at a target their intercepted messages refer to only by the code letters AF. Rochefort becomes convinced AF refers to Midway Atoll. Naval intelligence analysts in Washington disagree, arguing the true target is more likely to be the west coast of the United States, or Hawaii itself, or the Aleutian Islands to the north. The disagreement is not a minor bureaucratic dispute. An entire fleet, and quite possibly the outcome of the war in the Pacific, hinges on guessing correctly. To settle it, Rochefort's team arranges for Midway's garrison to send a message, deliberately unencrypted, complaining that its freshwater distillation equipment has broken down. Within days, Japanese signal traffic intercepted by Station Hypo references a water shortage at AF. It is confirmation, as close to definitive as code-breaking allows. Nimitz backs Rochefort's conclusion fully, over the continued skepticism of officers in Washington who outrank both of them. It is a decision that, within weeks, will determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. As the Midway operation takes shape in the final weeks of May, Nimitz faces one more decision that reveals the same instinct he showed with Leighton and Rochefort. Vice Admiral William Halsey, the aggressive, well-known carrier commander who would normally lead the American task force into this battle, is hospitalized with a severe skin condition just as the fleet prepares to sail, a small, almost absurd medical detail that threatens to remove the Navy's most experienced carrier fighter from the single most important battle of the war so far. From his hospital bed, Halsey recommends his own replacement, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a capable, methodical cruiser commander who has never in his career commanded a carrier task force and has no personal background in naval aviation at all. On paper, it is a strange, even reckless choice, promoting an officer with no carrier experience into command of the fleet's most critical carriers days before the largest naval gamble of the war. Nimitz, who barely knows Spruance personally, approves the appointment anyway, trusting Halsey's judgment and the pattern he has already established with every other appointment since Christmas morning. He chooses the officer he judges best suited to the moment, not the one with the most conventional credentials, and lets the results speak for themselves. June 4, 1942. Exactly 6 months after Chester Nimitz took command of a fleet that Washington had all but written off, the Battle of Midway begins. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto has assembled the largest Japanese naval force gathered since the Pearl Harbor Strike Force itself. 4 fleet aircraft carriers, 7 battleships trailing behind as a heavier reserve, and more than 200 carrier aircraft, in a plan designed to lure the remaining American fleet into a decisive trap and annihilate it once and for all. Japanese naval intelligence, still working from outdated assumptions, believes the Americans have only 2 operational aircraft carriers left in the entire Pacific. They are wrong. Nimitz has 3. The carrier Yorktown, badly damaged barely a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, has been repaired in an extraordinary 72-hour marathon effort at the very same Pearl Harbor shipyard that Japanese bombers failed to destroy back in December. And because of Rochefort's work, Nimitz already knows, with unusual confidence, almost exactly where Yamamoto's fleet is heading and when it will arrive. The ambush that unfolds at Midway is not the one Yamamoto planned. It is Nimitz's. In roughly 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers launched from Enterprise and Yorktown strike 3 Japanese fleet carriers in rapid succession. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are all burning within minutes of one another, their flight decks crowded with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft that turn each ship into an uncontrollable inferno, black smoke climbing thousands of feet into the clear Pacific sky, visible for miles across open water. Sailors aboard nearby Japanese destroyers watch in stunned silence as ships that had seemed invincible only minutes earlier become floating pyres, secondary explosions tearing through their hulls as stored bombs and torpedoes cook off in the heat. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launches a furious counterattack that damages Yorktown severely, but by the end of that same day, American aircraft find and destroy Hiryu as well. By the time the Battle of Midway ends, Japan has lost all 4 of the fleet carriers it brought to the battle, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men, including a disproportionate number of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. The strategic implications are immediate and permanent. Japan's carrier strength, built up over decades and impossible to quickly replace, is shattered in a single day. The experienced pilots lost in the flames over Midway cannot be replaced either, not in any meaningful time frame, because Japan's pilot training system is too slow, too rigid, and too small to produce new aviators of comparable skill fast enough to matter. The strategic initiative in the Pacific War, which Japan had held completely since the morning of December 7th, passes permanently into American hands. In Washington, the doubters fall silent almost overnight. Admiral Ernest King, who had dismissed Nimitz as a desk admiral only months earlier, watches the results of Midway arrive in intelligence reports and understands immediately what has happened. Nimitz has not simply won a single battle. He has in 6 months rebuilt a fleet that experts had privately written off, placed enormous trust in an eccentric codebreaker working out of a basement, positioned his forces with a precision that bordered on prophecy, and delivered what will come to be remembered as one of the most decisive naval victories in modern military history. He accomplished it with a force that, on the morning of December 25, 1941, had consisted of little more than smoke, wreckage, and demoralized survivors. Back at Pearl Harbor, the news of Midway spreads through the harbor in a way that feels entirely different from the news that arrived 6 months earlier. Sailors who once walked past the wreckage of Battleship Row with their eyes down now gather around radio sets and bulletin boards, reading and rereading casualty figures that, for the first time since the war began, belong to the enemy rather than to them. Men who buried friends in the days after December 7th, who spent Christmas of 1941 wondering whether the war was already lost before it had properly begun, allow themselves, cautiously, to believe that something has genuinely turned. Nimitz himself, by every account from those closest to him, does not celebrate. He receives the reports quietly, at his desk, the same way he has received every report since Christmas morning, already turning his attention to the next problem, the next campaign, the long, grinding road that still stretches ahead of them across thousands of miles of open ocean toward Tokyo. For Kimmel, watching from the sidelines of a career that has already ended, the news of Midway carries a different weight entirely, a bitter reminder of how quickly fortunes in the Pacific can turn once given the right combination of resources, timing, and leadership willing to gamble on intelligence that Washington itself doubted. For Pai, who made the cautious call that let Wake Island fall, it is a quiet vindication of nothing and an indictment of everything, proof that boldness, backed by good information and quiet trust in subordinates, could have changed outcomes that caution alone never would. Midway does not end the war. It only ends the possibility that Japan might win it outright, and the 3 years that follow are still long, brutal, and expensive in ways that no single battle, however decisive, could ever fully account for. Through the second half of 1942, Nimitz commits the rebuilt Pacific Fleet to Guadalcanal, a grinding 6-month campaign fought in malarial jungle and shark-infested straits that will cost thousands of American lives before the island is finally secured. It is followed by the slow, methodical grind through the Solomon Islands, and then the beginning of what strategists come to call the island-hopping campaign, a deliberate, patient strategy of seizing key positions while bypassing others, stretching Japan's supply lines past their breaking point, one island at a time. It is a campaign built entirely on the same instincts Nimitz brought to Pearl Harbor on Christmas morning 1941: logistics, patience, and a refusal to waste men chasing objectives that do not serve the larger strategy. The fleet under his command grows at a pace that would have seemed unimaginable to the men standing amid the wreckage of Battleship Row in December 1941. By the war's final year, Chester Nimitz commands more than 2 million men and women, over 5,000 ships, and roughly 20,000 aircraft, a force so vast and so thoroughly rebuilt that almost nothing of the shattered fleet he inherited remains recognizable within it, except perhaps the quiet, unglamorous philosophy that rebuilt it in the first place. In December 1944, he is promoted to the rank of Fleet Admiral, a 5-star rank that, by the war's end, only 4 men in the entire history of the United States Navy will ever hold. The desk admiral that Ernest King once dismissed as unsuited for war now outranks nearly every officer who once doubted him. By 1945, the men who served under him, many of them the same junior officers who once expected to be quietly purged along with Kimmel's reputation, have watched Nimitz age visibly under the weight of nearly 4 years of continuous command, his hair turning fully white, his manner no less quiet than it had been on that first Christmas morning, but carrying now the settled authority of a man who has been proven right at every major turning point of the war. He has buried friends and subordinates by the thousands, signed off on campaigns that cost tens of thousands of American lives, and carried each of those decisions with the same private, undemonstrative composure that unsettled Washington in December 1941, and that his own sailors eventually came to trust more than they trusted almost any other quality in a wartime commander. The war in the Pacific ends, fittingly, not with a speech from Nimitz but with his signature. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signs the Japanese Instrument of Surrender as the official representative of the United States. One signature among several from the Allied powers, but the one belonging to the man who had arrived at Pearl Harbor 3 years and 9 months earlier in a borrowed civilian suit, standing at the edge of a harbor that most experts believed America might never recover from. He signs it the same way he accepted his original command, quietly, without ceremony beyond what protocol strictly requires, standing on the deck of a ship in a harbor far from the small Texas town where he was born. For years afterward, historians and journalists return again and again to the same question, the one that Washington itself struggled with in December 1941. Why Nimitz? Dozens of admirals outranked him at the time of his appointment. Many had more combat experience. Several had already led carrier task forces into battle. At least one of them, William Halsey, would go on to prove himself one of the most aggressive and celebrated fleet commanders in American military history. Roosevelt passed over every one of them and chose instead the personnel administrator, the man who had spent the years before the war quietly managing which officers went where. The easy explanation, the one most often repeated, is that Nimitz was simply untainted by the Pearl Harbor disaster, a clean name in a Navy suddenly desperate for one. That explanation is true, but it is incomplete, and it misses the deeper judgment Roosevelt was actually making. The problem facing the Pacific Fleet in December 1941 was never primarily tactical. It was institutional. The fleet did not need a warrior eager to avenge Pearl Harbor with aggression alone. It needed someone capable of taking a broken organization, shattered morale, destroyed ships, demoralized crews, and a panicked command structure, and quietly, systematically rebuilding all of it into something capable of winning a war that would ultimately stretch across half the globe. That is not, in the end, a task suited to a warrior poet. It is a task suited to an engineer, a builder, a man who has spent decades solving unglamorous problems that other, more celebrated officers considered beneath them. Nimitz's approach stands in quiet, permanent contrast to the man he replaced. Kimmel had been a meticulous, hands-on commander, consumed with every detail of fleet readiness, respected by his subordinates for his intensity, but, by several accounts, exhausted by the same intensity that consumed him. When disaster came, Kimmel's tightly centralized style left little room for delegation, little margin for recovery, and almost no mechanism for absorbing a shock of the scale Japan delivered that Sunday morning. Nimitz operates almost in deliberate opposite fashion. He delegates authority readily, at times to a degree that makes officials in Washington visibly uncomfortable. He hands Raymond Spruance command of the carrier task force at Midway, despite Spruance having no carrier aviation background whatsoever. He keeps Edwin Layton on as his intelligence officer, despite Layton's association, however unfair, with the Pearl Harbor failure. He backs Joseph Rochefort's reading of Japanese intentions, when Washington's own analysts insist he is wrong. Any one of these decisions, made incorrectly, could have ended his career and quite possibly cost the Pacific War. Each one, instead, works. The pattern holds throughout the rest of the war. Nimitz consistently chooses the person he judges best suited to a task, regardless of politics, seniority, or conventional military wisdom. The same philosophy Franklin Roosevelt applied when he looked past dozens of more senior, more decorated officers and chose Nimitz himself on a difficult morning in December 1941. It is, in the end, the same gamble repeated at every level of command, and it keeps paying off. In 1964, 23 years after the attack that ended his predecessor's career and launched his own, a retired Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz sits for an interview and is asked, as he had been asked many times before, about Pearl Harbor. His answer, according to those who spoke with him in his later years, is not the one most interviewers expect. Nimitz reflects that in a strange way, it had been fortunate that the fleet was caught at anchor in Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, rather than at sea. Had Kimmel somehow known the Japanese were coming and sailed out to intercept them, he suggests, the American battleships, slower than the Japanese carriers, outgunned by their aircraft, and with no air cover of their own, would very likely have met Japan's carrier force in open ocean and been sunk there instead, in deep water, far from any hope of rescue. The same crews who were pulled alive from capsized hulls in the shallow harbor, who survived to fight again at Midway and beyond, would instead have gone down with their ships in water thousands of feet deep, drowned in numbers that could have dwarfed even the losses of December 7th. Instead, at Pearl Harbor, the water was shallow enough that most of the crews could be saved. 6 of the 8 battleships damaged that morning were eventually raised, repaired, and returned to active service. The submarine base, the fuel farms, the repair yards, all left untouched by Japanese planners focused entirely on capital ships, remained intact and ready to be used. And every aircraft carrier in the fleet had been at sea, spared entirely, on the one morning when their absence seemed like nothing but bad luck. The disaster that ended one navy, in other words, created the exact conditions needed to build a different one in its place. Chester Nimitz, the administrator that dozens of senior admirals effectively refused to become, the quiet Texan the American press dismissed, and the Navy establishment doubted, appears to have understood this truth more clearly, and far sooner, than almost anyone else standing at the edge of that burning harbor on Christmas morning in 1941. Whether any other officer on that long list of men who were considered and passed over, or who quietly made sure their own names never reached it, could have seen the same thing in the smoke and wreckage of Battleship Row is a question history has never been able to answer, and perhaps never fully will. What is certain is that the one man who did see it was standing there in a borrowed civilian suit, and that 6 months later, the entire course of the Pacific War had changed because of it. The 8 battleships that once lay in the mud of Pearl Harbor, the ones that American doctrine had built an entire pre-war navy around, are almost all gone from active service by 1945, replaced not by newer battleships but by carriers, submarines, and an intelligence apparatus that a handful of eccentric codebreakers built out of a windowless basement room. It is not the Navy Kimmel commanded, and it is not the Navy that dozens of admirals imagined they might one day lead. It is the Navy that a quiet, unremarkable rear admiral from a small German town in the Texas Hill Country built instead, out of wreckage, out of trust extended to men other officers would have discarded, and out of a willingness to gamble everything on the word of a man in a bathrobe working through the night in a basement, because he judged that man's judgment sound. Dozens of admirals said no to Pearl Harbor. History remembers instead the one man who was never asked to say yes, because almost no one thought to ask him at all, until the day nothing else was left to try.